In the 1500s, one African empire was bigger than France, richer than most of Europe, and feared by every army that crossed its borders. Its libraries held more books than entire European kingdoms. Then, in one single afternoon, it was gone. So why have most people never heard its name? Welcome back. If you love real history, the kind they don't teach you in school, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because today we're talking about the Songhai Empire, the African superpower that controlled gold, ruled millions of people, and then disappeared from most history books. Stay until the end because the reason historians ignored it is more shocking than the empire itself. Long before it became an empire, Songhai was just a small kingdom sitting on the banks of the Niger River, near a city called Gao in what is now the country of Mali. The river was not just water flowing through the desert. It was a highway. Boats could carry soldiers, food, and trade goods faster and easier than any camel crossing the open sand. Gao sat at a perfect crossing point, where gold coming up from the forests in the south met salt and goods coming down from the trade routes in the north. For generations, fishing communities and small traders lived along this stretch of river, slowly building a kingdom that most outsiders barely noticed, a kingdom that had likely existed in some form since at least the 11th century, long before it ever threatened to become an empire. For a long time, Songhai lived quietly in the shadow of a much bigger neighbor, the Mali Empire, the same empire that once made a king named Mansa Musa one of the richest men who has ever lived, a man whose wealth in gold was so large that, according to historical accounts, his travels alone affected the price of gold in the regions he passed through. Next to a power like that, Songhai was small. Songhai was overlooked, but that was about to change completely. Everything shifted when a new ruler took the throne, a warrior named Sunni Ali. He came to power around the year 1464, and he ruled for almost 30 years, spending much of that time on military campaigns. Sunni Ali had an idea that few rulers in the region had tried before on this scale. Instead of relying only on horses and foot soldiers, he built a war fleet, a navy of canoes that moved soldiers up and down the Niger River. This gave him speed that his enemies could not match. He could strike a city before its defenders even knew an army was near, landing troops directly at the riverbank instead of marching for weeks across open land. One by one, he captured the wealthy trading cities of Timbuktu and Janneh, taking control of the very gold and salt routes that had once made the Mali Empire so powerful. These were not small prizes. Timbuktu and Janneh were already famous trading centers, filled with merchants, scholars, and goods moving between the desert and the forest regions further south. By the time Sunni Ali died, around 1492, the small river kingdom that nobody used to notice was gone. In its place stood the strongest military power in West Africa. Sunni Ali himself was a complicated figure. He followed Islam, the same religion practiced by the merchant scholars of Timbuktu, but he also kept many older African traditions alive at the same time, which put him at odds with some of the strict religious scholars in the cities he had just conquered. This tension between the throne and the scholarly class in Timbuktu would echo for generations, even as the empire kept growing, shaping how future rulers tried to balance military power with religious legitimacy. After Sunni Ali, a new leader rose to power, a man named Askia Muhammad. If Sunni Ali built the empire through war, Askia Muhammad built it through order. He divided Songhai into provinces, each one run by its own governor who answered directly to the central government in Gao. He created separate departments to manage taxes, farming, trade, and the military, a level of bureaucratic organization that was rare almost anywhere in the world at that time. He also built something many large empires lacked, a professional standing army, soldiers who trained and fought as their full-time occupation, instead of farmers who only picked up weapons when trouble arrived at their door. Askia Muhammad also made a long pilgrimage to Mecca, traveling with a massive amount of gold and a large group of attendants, a journey that impressed scholars and rulers across North Africa and the Middle East, and helped spread word of Songhai's wealth far beyond West Africa. Under his rule, the empire grew into one of the largest states on Earth, stretching across land bigger than Western Europe, covering parts of what is now Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso. He took the title Askia, which became the name of the new ruling dynasty he founded, and he appointed Islamic judges, known as qadis, in major cities to apply religious law alongside local custom. His armies also pushed further outward, gaining control over the valuable salt mines at Tagaza in the north and extending influence eastward toward the Hausa's city-states, bringing even more trade routes under Songhai's control. And then there was Timbuktu. While most people today picture Timbuktu only as a symbol for some faraway, unknown place, in the 1500s it was one of the greatest centers of learning on the planet. Scholars at the Songhai Center studied astronomy, law, medicine, and religion, and the city held an enormous collection of handwritten manuscripts, some covering science and mathematics, others covering history and law. Books were copied by hand, traded, and sold. And in Timbuktu, a single rare book could sometimes be worth more than gold itself. Foreign travelers who visited the city wrote home in disbelief, describing a place where knowledge had become one of the most valuable things a person could buy or own. Historians today estimate that hundreds of thousands of manuscripts from this era still survive in private family collections and libraries across the region, a number that hints at just how much writing, record-keeping, and scholarship was happening in Songhai long before most outsiders ever imagined it. The empire's wealth flowed mainly from controlling the trans-Saharan trade, taxing the gold, salt, copper, and kola nuts that passed through its cities on the way to markets across Africa and the Mediterranean world. Caravans carrying these goods moved through Songhai territory constantly, sometimes made up of hundreds of camels at a time, and the empire's army existed partly to protect this trade and keep the routes safe and profitable. In return for this protection, Songhai's treasury collected taxes and tolls at major crossing points, a steady stream of income that funded the professional army, the provincial governors, and the growing administration Askia Muhammad had built. At its peak, nobody thought Songhai could fall, but empires rarely die from outside attacks alone. They usually break from the inside first. After Askia Muhammad grew old and was eventually removed from power, deposed and blinded by his own son in 1528, the empire entered a long period of instability. Sons, brothers, and other relatives fought bitterly over who would rule next, and one ruler after another rose and fell in quick succession over the following decades. Each new power struggle drained money, weakened loyalty among regional governors, and pulled attention away from the empire's borders and defenses. While Songhai's leaders were busy fighting each other for the throne, a new threat was quietly forming far to the north in the Sultanate of Morocco. Morocco wanted access to the same gold that had made Songhai rich for over a century, and crucially, Morocco had recently gained access to something most armies in the region had never faced before in large numbers: gunpowder weapons, including muskets and cannons. Songhai still had, on paper, the largest army in the region. What it didn't have anymore was unity, and it didn't have the right weapons for what was coming. In 1591, a Moroccan force made an extremely difficult crossing of the Sahara Desert, losing soldiers and supplies along the way just to reach Songhai territory. When the two armies finally met at a place called Tondibi, near the Niger River, the numbers alone should have made the outcome obvious. Morocco crossed the desert with only a few thousand men, having lost many more along the punishing journey through the Sahara, while Songhai gathered tens of thousands of soldiers to meet them, an army many times larger than the invaders. Songhai's army was made up of experienced cavalry and infantry that had defended the empire for generations. But the Moroccan soldiers carried muskets and cannons, weapons that could kill from a distance, long before an enemy soldier ever got close enough to use a sword, a spear, or a horse charge. Songhai's army fought the way it had fought successfully for over a century, with fast cavalry charges meant to break enemy lines through speed and force. None of it mattered against gunfire. The noise, smoke, and shock of the muskets caused panic among Songhai's soldiers and horses who had never experienced this kind of attack before. Animals reared and bolted at the sound of the blasts, formations broke apart before they ever reached the enemy line, and what should have been an easy victory for the much larger army turned into chaos within hours. Within hours, the much larger Songhai force broke apart and scattered. The Moroccan force was led by a commander named Judar Pasha, and what makes this battle so important is that his much smaller army won mainly through technology, not through superior numbers or even superior bravery. This is one of the clearest examples in history of how a sudden gap in weapons technology can defeat a far larger and more experienced force in a matter of hours. After the defeat at Tondibi, Moroccan soldiers marched into Gao and then Timbuktu, looting both cities and capturing what they could. In a single afternoon, one of Africa's greatest empires lost control of the cities it had spent generations building in, trading in, and learning in. The empire never recovered from this defeat. It broke apart into smaller, weaker successor states, while the Moroccan-controlled territory around Gao and Timbuktu was placed under a series of governors known as pashas, who faced frequent revolts and struggled to hold the region together for long. Over the following decades, the importance of the old trans-Saharan trade routes slowly faded as European ships began trading directly along Africa's western coastline instead of relying on desert caravans. But here is the part that finally explains the question we started with. Songhai did not vanish from the historical record. Scholars living in Timbuktu had already written detailed chronicles about the empire, recording its rulers, its wars, its laws, and its daily life in Arabic-language manuscripts that survived for centuries inside private family libraries. The written evidence was there the entire time. What was missing was attention. During the colonial era, many European historians dismissed African kingdoms as simple societies without real recorded history, a biased assumption that ignored clear written evidence of organized governments, professional armies, and centers of higher learning like the one in Timbuktu. This wasn't only true for Songhai. Across the continent, large and complex African societies were often described in colonial-era writing as primitive or unorganized, even when physical ruins, written records, or oral traditions clearly proved otherwise. Because African history was so often filtered through a European point of view, classrooms around the world spent far more time studying European, Asian, and Middle Eastern empires, while a state as large, wealthy, and advanced as Songhai barely earned a mention, even though at its height it ruled more land and more people than several European kingdoms of the exact same era. It was never that the proof didn't exist. It was that the people writing the history books decided it simply wasn't worth including. Only in recent decades have historians and archaeologists worked seriously to recover, preserve, and translate the surviving manuscripts of Timbuktu, slowly bringing the true size and sophistication of the Songhai Empire back into public knowledge. Today, the historic city of Timbuktu is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and ongoing preservation projects continue working to protect its remaining manuscripts and mud brick monuments from damage caused by weather, conflict, and time. In modern Mali and Niger, the legacy of Songhai still shows up in local history, place names, and cultural pride, even if the wider world took centuries to start paying attention again. Songhai was never truly lost. It was simply left out of the story by people who decided whose history counted and whose didn't. Songhai built libraries instead of just empires, and armies that ruled millions, yet most history books gave it a single paragraph, if that. It traded in gold, ruled with order, and produced scholars whose work still survive today. And somehow, almost none of that made it into the version of history most of us were taught. If this video taught you something new today, that's exactly why this channel exists, to tell the stories that got left out of the textbooks. Subscribe now if you want more forgotten history like this. Drop a comment telling me which empire you want covered next, and share this video with one person who still thinks African history started with colonization. It didn't. It started here, on the banks of the Niger River, centuries before anyone in Europe ever wrote it down.